Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to do this quick video for anybody who was absent from class today. It's really just a few of the highlights of some things that we looked at, along with an email of some of the sources that we looked at. So a few things. We did continue a little bit of a discussion about the political cartoons we started to look at last class. These were political cartoons that really showed a great deal of evidence of increasing nativism in the time period of the turn of the century. This is something that, perhaps we can also make a big analogy to today, right? So we are seeing and living in a time period where, at least coming from federal government, a lot of nativist immigration laws. And at the time period of the late 1800s, early 1900s, really up until the time period of the 1920s, we see just escalating nativist immigration laws. And some of this may be driven by a variety of factors, but we noted last time that immigration patterns had started to shift and change. Some of the immigration patterns included Southern and Eastern Europeans, and we do see an increase in nativist groups and in nativist laws. Some of this is very specific. So, for example, in 1882, which is really 20 years after Reconstruction. So, if we think of the degree of racism that was involved when we talked about that topic, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, it really speaks of some of the racism that was occurring, in particular in the west coast of the country, against immigrants who were largely male, who had come from China for jobs. Earlier in the 1800s, we see some of this immigration pattern in the railroads, in some other areas as well, even during the time of like the gold rush. But, now in the late 1800s, there's a great deal of pushback. And some of this is regarding, economic competition for jobs. Some of this is racism. It's a variety of things, but Chinese Exclusion Act. And, there are other ways too that there is outside of the law a lot of other efforts to exclude Chinese immigrants. Chinatowns, on one hand, become immigrant communities that offer a great deal for people to enable some acculturation and kind of preserving some Chinese culture, but they also, really start out as spaces where people get pushed to. So they are kind of excluded spaces also. But the Chinese Exclusion Act is a federal law. It is in place for 10 years and then it gets reinstated and then reinstated. But the Chinese Exclusion Act does not allow Chinese laborers into the United States. And at the time in the 1800s, this is the primary, way or the primary role that immigrants from China are playing. So it does have the effect of really reducing immigration from China. This is a very notable law because it distinguishes based on country of origin and based on ethnicity. So that's something that, today with readings of the Equal Protection Clause, we would like to imagine that such laws would not be constitutional today. And again, we're in a very unique time period, with nativism and immigration. In 1891, we see an expanded list of what, and we have this in quotes, this idea of like undesirable immigrants. This is the language that's used at the time, this kind of listing that maybe gets provided to Ellis Island. And there are actual, instructions written for how to do the, tests to see if somebody is mentally incompetent and whatnot. And it's like organized by age. Like if you're 6 years old, you should be able to do this. If you're 7 years old. So there's kind of this like checklist of sorts that people going through Ellis Island might succumb to if they were suspected of maybe being an undesirable immigrant. Some of the group that gets expanded, we see idiots, insane persons, paupers, or persons likely to become federal charges, persons suffering from a loathsome or dangerous disease. So, this is kind of the, beginnings of immigration restriction. Eventually, we see people who have been convicted of a felony, other infamous crime, polygamists, people who are, involved in, marrying more than one woman, usually. The other thing that we talked about were some of those political cartoons. So look back at those and let me know if you have a question about them. Some of those political cartoons that we looked at in class had really extensive racism or anti-Semitism in them. The last one was very anti-Semitic, that kind of reflected on one side of the cartoon. I'll pull it up so that way, because I've got a different cartoon up we looked at last class. The other thing that we talked about today were two nativist organizations. So we see groupings of people that start to establish like an influence on policy. One is the American Protective Association. This is a group that was very nativist in a particular way. They basically feared that Roman Catholics were going to be knocking Protestants out of places of political power. And there were some conspiracy theories that essentially went along with this organization. The idea that the papacy, that the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, was out to kind of gain much greater political power. And, there was a sense that people, would take an oath to be part of this group to essentially relate to, only those of the Protestant Christian faith. So, this is just a time where religion creates a barrier in some ways, and this is one source of nativism. This was similar to an earlier political party known as the Know Nothing Party. It was a very nativist party. So it's not necessarily the first organization of its kind, but it really did have some unique traits, and the degree of like conspiracy theory makes it an interesting organization. One thing that we looked at was the oath that people took to be part of the APA. So check that out. Another organization, and this one in some ways is much more dangerous because it was much more popular, almost like kind of the version that was deemed as an acceptable type of immigration restriction in circles that were like academic, for example. The Immigration Restriction League is a group that really came out of some academic institutions. So we see some of the leaders of this actually be college professors, and some of this really reeks of what we would call eugenics, the idea of kind of enabling a almost along those social Darwinist lines, like almost like rigging the gene pool to include certain things that are seen as desirable and taking out certain things that are seen as undesirable. So Immigrant Restriction League starts to speak out about kind of the melting pot idea and immigrants that are coming into the society that are paupers or charges of the state, people who are illiterate, that sort of thing. So there's almost like a kind of academic elitism type of league that is looking to create immigration based on a pattern of very, very skilled immigrants, and the choice kind of policy that many in the Immigration Restriction League. And I also posted in materials for class a couple of things written by the Immigration Restriction League, so you can look at some of the language and see how and why this became so dangerous, because it kind of normalized this social Darwinist idea that the gene pool, in a sense, could be polluted or rigged in a way to be better if immigrants were screened. So lots and lots of the Immigration Restriction League focus was on a literacy test, which failed in Congress quite a few times. The Immigration Restriction League kind of goes to the early 1900s. By 1917, however, there is actually a literacy test that passes, and there is a extensive literacy test. It's 40 or 50 words or something like that, and it didn't have to be done in English. It could be done in other languages too. But the asking of the question became not enough. People were asked to take a literacy test, and that could actually restrict somebody. There was also kind of these ideas of like undesirable immigration becoming like it was normalized to say that that was very problematic. The other thing that comes out of the 1917 Immigration Restriction Act, which is a time of like very heightened nativism. 1917 is also in the time period after World War II is not quite over in 1917. So there's a great deal of insecurity and fear as a result of the war. In 1917 is also the Russian Revolution. So you have kind of this threat of socialism and Bolshevism. And so there's some additional political things happening that create maybe this uptick in nativism, more fear, more issues of scapegoating. But we also see something called the Asiatic Zone. This is actually mapped in the 100-page law of the Immigration Act of 1917, and you can see the Asiatic Zone, which is in the pink. People who live in the areas that are in pink become unable to immigrate to the United States, and this includes quite a few groups of people. Note, it doesn't include a good part of Eastern China, for the most part, which is already banned through the Chinese Exclusion Act. Japan and Korea were also already banned because of a gentleman's agreement in 1907. So there were quite a few bans on Asian immigrants, and this 1917 legislation takes that further. We see Afghanistan, India, British India at the time. Philippines is exempt because the United States has imperialized Philippines, and by the 1917 time period, it is kind of part of the United States. And if we get into that topic and the way in which there's debate in the United States about annexing the Philippines, but we'll look at that topic a little separately. But you can kind of get a sense of the degree of restrictions that occur in 1917, and that only gets more restrictive by the time of 1924, where there's a National Origins Act, where the cap on immigrants is lowered, and there's also it's figured to include a percentage of immigrant groups, mostly from Europe, but also it kind of is rigged in a way, the 1920s law. It's, dependent on people's country of origin. Some countries are enabled to bring more immigrants than others, depending on percentage of immigrants from an earlier census. So it caters, in a sense, to increasing the number of immigrants from Western Europe, and that's essentially what happens throughout the 1920s. And this continues largely until the 1960s. The 1950s is another period where specific groups of immigrants are prohibited, including people in the category of sexually deviant, which could affect LGBTQ individuals. So there's like all kinds of additional restrictions. By 1965 in the civil rights movement, there's a push to enable much of the immigration to be a very different system and much more consistent with the type of system that we have today, which is inclusive of like family reunification, so preferences for immigrants who are either family members of American citizens or of legal